We have something called the blood-brain barrier that helps to protect our brain against things that are circulating in our blood. Like I said, it's really picky, so there are bouncers at the door kind of letting certain things in and letting certain things out. But with chronic metabolic dysfunction from a variety of different causes, whether it's excessive inflammatory adipose tissue, hormonal dysfunction, or even people with insulin and sugar handling issues, those bouncers start to be not as good at their job. So things start to get into the brain circulation that maybe shouldn't, and that can have detrimental effects on brain health in the short term and also in the long term.
Welcome to the Dr. Ashley Show.
Welcome to the Dr. Ashley Show. I'm Dr. Ashley, and today I am honored to have Dr. Zaremba with us as a guest talking all about brain health. Dr. Z is a board-certified chiropractic neurologist with over 3 years of experience as the lead clinician at a top brain rehabilitation clinic. With over 500 hours of postdoctoral studies in clinical neuroscience and hundreds of patients treated, Dr. Z is skilled at activating the brain's ability to recover and become optimal. Dr. Z's specialized training includes diagnosing and treating brain, spine, and nervous disorders without medication or surgery. He has extensive experience treating patients recovering from traumatic brain injury, addiction, cognitive decline, and those seeking peak performance. As an exercise and sports science graduate and collegiate ice hockey player at UNC Chapel Hill, Dr. Z's personal experience with concussions sparked a deep interest in traumatic brain injuries and set him on his career path. He completed his postgraduate training at Palmer Chiropractic College, earning his Doctor of Chiropractic degree. When not treating patients, Dr. Z enjoys spending time hiking, rock climbing, or practicing yoga with his wife and dogs. Let's welcome Dr. Z to the show. Dr. Z, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. This is awesome. I've been looking forward to it.
I know we get to see each other in person since you're local to Asheville, but now here we're going to spread the news and share all the good work that you guys do on brain health.
Perfect. Well, yeah, much appreciated. I'm a huge fan of your show, and I'm looking forward to just seeing where the discussion goes. I think there's just so much great things that we both do for our patients that really overlap. And, I think that that's a cool thing that, we'll be able to let people learn about on listening to this podcast is how brain health and metabolic health are intimately linked.
Yeah, well, will you start by just sharing with us a little bit about Apex Brain Centers, what your team's approach is on just overall brain health and wellness, who you serve, your approach to their brain health journey? Start off with just kind of an overarching idea of what you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Apex Brain Centers, we're an outpatient intensive treatment center with most of our patients doing these immersive treatments where they're in the office for 4 to 5 hours a day, typically for 2 to 3 weeks. Of course, we treat a lot of people locally from Western North Carolina, but also we see people from all over the country and all over the world. So it's kind of cool the people that I get to meet. So the types of patients that we work with typically are people who have suffered brain injuries, whether it's a concussion, stroke, or TBI. We also see people for learning and behavioral difficulties, things like ADHD, OCD, other types of issues along those lines. Oftentimes there's overlap where someone has a concussion and then their OCD gets worse, something along those lines. And then the other main category of patients that we see is neurodegenerative disease. So things along the lines of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, but also diseases like multiple sclerosis. And I actually saw a patient with ALS recently too, or Lou Gehrig's disease. So we see all of what we do is very brain focused, but we do end up seeing a few different conditions, and we're a comprehensive center. So when people come in, initially we go through an evaluation to look at functional testing of the brain, things like QEEG, eye movement, computerized quantification, computerized balance, or posturography testing. And then at the end of the first day, we typically meet and have a lot of dots to connect. A lot of people, we're not their first stop. So they've already been to, hopefully the emergency room for whatever situation. And then by the time they get to us, sort of how do we help maximize their brain health? And we also see people for what we call neurooptimization. So people that maybe they don't have a brain injury, but they just want to function at a higher level, whether that's for professional purposes, personal goals, or people that have a genetic profile of, different types of brain diseases and want to make sure that they lower their risk as much as possible as they age. when we go through that with people, we're obviously doing a lot of different forms of brain stimulation, brain exercises, things along those lines. But the lifestyle coaching and metabolic health is certainly a big part of it. And there's different levels to that. Some people come to us and they're not doing a good job taking care of themselves. Some people just need, a little help with the details. But all the things that we learn, when we're younger, like all the basic things like get good sleep, get exercise, get in the sunlight, eat right. All those things are things that we're coaching these people with brain injuries to do because it helps to maximize their brain healing.
Mm-hmm. So then how does chronic metabolic dysfunction and, excessive fat, weight impact and affect the brain? Because a lot of our listeners are either in the process of dropping weight or have dropped significant weight and are keeping it off. So can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the brain is, while it's very different than a lot of our other organs, it's still just that. It's an organ. It needs energy. It needs blood flow. But it's really picky about its surroundings is how I like to describe that to people. So when we talk about things like metabolic health, we're talking about insulin resistance is a huge one. And people that have insulin resistance, what happens is their blood sugar has been high for so long that the molecule that helps their cells to absorb that, called insulin, isn't working anymore appropriately. So they need higher levels of that, and that circulating in our body can be detrimental actually to our brain in the way that it's working. We have something called the blood-brain barrier that helps to protect our brain against things that are circulating in our blood. Like I said, it's really picky. So there are bouncers at the door kind of letting certain things in and letting certain things out. But with chronic metabolic dysfunction, from a variety of different causes, whether it's excessive inflammatory adipose tissue, hormonal dysfunction, or even people with insulin and sugar handling issues, those bouncers start to be not as good at their job. So things start to get into the brain circulation that maybe shouldn't, and that can have detrimental effects on brain health in the short term and also in the long term. So for our patients, a lot of times they're here trying to help. I see a lot of people that are going through paralysis, different forms of movement disorder, and trying to get up out of that wheelchair and trying to learn how to walk again. Oftentimes we go back to these basics of making sure you're healthy from a metabolic standpoint, because what we find too is people that are more unhealthy when they suffer a brain injury or a stroke or whatever type of injury, their status tends to be worse off after the event if they weren't very healthy before. So all the things that people are doing to help with weight loss and to help with their metabolic health being better, they're also helping with their brain resilience and just their overall brain health in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and belly fat specifically, right? When we talk about excess fat, weight impacts the body a little bit differently. I talk about that belly fat and visceral fat. But does it play a role specifically in cognitive decline, dementia, other neurodegenerative diseases? And if so, why does it have such an impact?
Sure. And, that's something where in the medical literature, they've definitely drawn that conclusion where they have enough people in the database showing that, yes, if your BMI or your midline belly fat is at a certain point, you are at a higher risk for some of these neurodegenerative diseases. And the explanation for that oftentimes comes down to what we were just talking about with insulin resistance affecting the way that our neurons are able to harness energy. Because one thing to understand about the brain is that it's very different from, for example, a muscle cell. So with our muscles, when we're jogging or we're running and we start to run out of fuel, right, we're burning a lot of energy, our muscles have a backup energy source, right? Kind of like some people keep like this power bar in their backpack or something that's like, oh, I'll have that, on a day where I really need it. Our brain doesn't have that backup plan. So fluctuations in blood sugar, insulin, things like that have been one of the main mechanisms that's been elucidated in the medical literature in terms of what happens to these neurons that's related to this metabolic dysfunction. So insulin resistance for a lot of people is the key, but there are also other markers that are still being investigated and showing some promise in terms of that link, like certain strains of bacteria and other things in our microbiome can play a role. the blood-brain barrier dysfunction like we had just talked about, and even just systemic levels of inflammation. There are little cells in the brain called microglia, which are our like defense cells. So we've got the bouncers on the outside, we've got the microglia, that's the security inside, trying to help keep everything safe. And what happens is when the defense gets activated, it's hard for the brain to lower that, and it can be detrimental to our long-term health, but also our short-term function.
Yeah. And that visceral fat, it secretes different hormones too, interleukin 6 and those inflammatory hormones. So it increases insulin resistance, but then in and of itself, it's an active beast in there. I think it probably impacts the brain as well in that way.
Right, absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind too is that our nerve cells are kind of like these long wires because they're meant to go back and forth to these different relay centers or these different neuron pools to basically send communication back and forth. We can think of a word we want to say in a part of the brain called Wernicke's area, and then goes through this connection to what's called Broca's area, which is how we actually move our mouth and tongue and lips and speak. So when we look at that long connection wire, most of it is covered with this myelin sheath or this covering of fat. And those wires end up making up the large portion of the mass of the brain. So when we talk about fat metabolism and things like estrogen and hormones that play a role in how we're storing or utilizing or burning fat, it's very much affecting our brain health because our brain is basically a large fatty organ, but it needs to be fatty to be healthy.
Yeah. We say that cholesterol is bad, but what percentage of the brain is made up of cholesterol? A lot, isn't it?
It's a high percentage. I know I would say that probably about 50% or 70% of the brain is made up of fat. The other approximately 30% is made up of protein and some other things, circulating kind of things in there. But yeah, you're exactly right. It's a huge percentage of it is that fat and cholesterol, and not all cholesterol is created equal.
So what is the diet that you would advise people follow to have the best brain health possible?
That's a good question. In general, it's not really a one size fits all type of thing. But one of my favorite things to talk about with this therapy, or excuse me, with this topic, is the idea of blue zones. And there are actually some cool documentaries I've seen recently on Netflix that kind of outline some of this. But there are different parts of the world. I think there are like 6 different blue zones that have been identified, where there's a really high percentage of the population that are centenarians or people that live to be 100. And they tend to live to be 100 and thriving. If you'll like watch some of the videos, you'll see there's this one on Netflix that follows this old guy in this small town in Italy that he like walks 3 miles to this bar and he has like a glass of wine and then he walks home and he's, just 90 years old, excuse me. And that's just his life every day. And it looks at things like dietary factors and lifestyle factors. But in terms of diets that are heavy in omega-3 fatty acids, so the Mediterranean diet is one that gets a lot of attention in this regard. And there's some good research that shows it's helpful for the brain because like we talked about, the brain is mostly comprised of fat. And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. So omega-3s typically are things like your avocado, your nuts, especially fish is a great source of that. And then omega-6 is present in a lot of things like your animal fats, also present in in high concentrations in a lot of the unhealthy fats, things like canola oil or different types of seed oils that are oftentimes used in like industrial cooking processes that can drive some of those hormonal imbalances we talked about, affect the way that we're metabolizing fat and energy in the body, which then affects the brain too. So the Mediterranean diet can be a great one for most people. But a lot of times with our patients, we look at testing for different deficits and ways that we can help them accomplish their goals. So it's not really a one size fits all thing, but as a general recommendation, the Mediterranean diet is one that there's a lot of literature to support.
And are there any foods specifically that you would encourage people to avoid if they want to have the best brain health possible as they age?
That's a really good question. And pretty much anything that you can get through a drive-through for the most part. So things like fat foods are just immense bombs of this omega-6 fatty acid that, again, isn't a bad thing in moderate concentrations, but when we're not getting enough omega-3s and we get really high concentrations of omega-6s, that can kick off that whole inflammatory cascade that's really detrimental to the brain barrier, microbiome, all those things that we're talking about.
What about supplementation? Any supplements that you usually encourage people to consider?
You can't go wrong with, a good healthy fish oil, especially if people don't really like fish. Like as an example, I didn't grow up eating fish a lot in my diet, but I know it's healthy for me. So I like fish sometimes, but I have a weird relationship with it. So I try to eat it once a week. Most of the guidelines say that's typically enough for most people's just general nutritional needs. But I also take an omega just to be sure that my omega-3, an omega-3 fish oil, excuse me for shorthanding it. But I take one as well. That and then probiotics as well, because microbiome health is one of those things that we're continuing to learn more and more links to virtually any sort of health complaint out there. The microbiome has some specific strains or specific findings that can help to correlate with that. But then on the good side too, we can use probiotics and other tools that replenish the gut microbiome, like eating fermented foods. I eat sauerkraut almost every day. I love kimchi too. But those fermented foods also are a great way outside of just the traditional supplement route to help with microbiome health and diversity.
So you're saying eat sauerkraut and sardines.
Exactly, and
Lots
you
of
might not
miles
have
a day.
exactly,
And
and
one glass
you
of
might
wine.
sure, just make sure you have a few breath mints, if you're going to eat sauerkraut, and then go talk to somebody right away.
That's like my husband. He's in there eating sardines and sauerkraut mixed in a bowl. But hey, it is really tough to get that right ratio of omega-3s and 6s. I've had mine tested and I don't really eat processed foods very much. And still my omega-6 level's high. I don't cook with vegetable oils. So it's found in everything. And, I think if we eat animal protein, which is a good source of protein. So hopefully we're open to that. And when we do, what the animal eats is also important. So if they're grazing on a lot of omega-6 grains, I think that also influences the profile of the meat.
100%. And that's part of why, we're lucky enough where I live. I live kind of outside of town, kind of close to Fairview and Batcave. And Hickory Nut Gap Farms, they have great products, and it's grass-fed beef, and you can get organ meat, which has all sorts of health benefits too. You made a really good point on that too, where animal meats are great quality, but you got to keep in mind what they're eating. Another thing that's along those lines is one of the things we see in people with cognitive decline and dementia oftentimes is heavy metal toxicity. And one of the things associated with that is eating bigger fish tend to have higher concentrations of metals. So people that eat a lot of swordfish or a lot of canned tuna and things like that, it's okay in moderate amounts. But if it's like a major part of your diet and you're eating it multiple times a week, it might be worth getting your metal levels checked as well.
Do you eat organ meat yourself?
I do, not as brazenly as my daughter, who's 1 right now. She'll eat. I'm so proud because she'll pretty much eat whatever we put in front of her. So giving her little chunks of liver, and she's just nom nom nom. I love it. I have to find ways to kind of hide it. For example, there's this. I get the Vital Blend from Hickory Nut Gap Farm, where they blend ground beef with like hard kidney and liver, and I put that in chili. So that's a great way to kind of hide the taste of anything.
It is. Yeah, we feed that to our family, our kids. And when my kids were little, I would grate liver on top of everything that they would eat because, you guys, it's like a multivitamin. It has so many things in it, and vitamin A, vitamin D, copper, all these things that a lot of us are deficient in is found in liver. I do something that will probably turn off a lot of people, and I'm not necessarily recommending it, but they say that if you freeze liver, it will cause it will kill any kind of parasite that might be in it. So I get only the liver from Hickory Nut Gap, and I make sure it's frozen, and then I slice it in small pieces and I swallow it like a capsule because I cannot stand the taste of it at all. Even if I make a chili like you do, I taste it in there. But if I swallow it raw, I can't taste it. And I do that almost every night when I can remember. Yeah, but I know it's disgusting, but I'm desperate to get it
in. Absolutely. No, that's the same. And even like chicken livers is something that I've have in my freezer right now, and I've been meaning to cook, but
Yeah.
someone told me, I've heard through the grapevine, I guess you could say, that's a little more palatable.
Uh-huh.
We'll
It
see how
is.
this experiment works out for
Well,
me.
good luck with that. I hope that it's great.
I appreciate yeah, thank you.
So you mentioned brain fog, and man, I get brain fog. And so I wanted to understand what are the main factors or things you see that cause brain fog and cognitive decline? I know those are two separate things, but if you could talk about maybe what causes those things, what are the culprits?
Yeah, totally. So one of the main things that we see, especially with metabolic health, and brain fog, especially for the population that maybe hasn't had a history of concussions or learning and behavioral disorders, is still an immensely common thing. Some of that you can contribute to post COVID, but a
Mhm.
lot of it comes down to when we talk about the brain. One thing to understand is that a fifth of the calories, or 20% of your caloric intake, is immediately burned by your brain. So that's regardless of if you're running a marathon, lifting weights, etc. Just keeping our heart pumping, keeping our brain active, 20% of what we eat goes right up there. So oftentimes you'll see the brain referred to as the greedy master because it's sort of in charge of fuel appropriation and burning in the body, but it's also going to make sure that it always has enough to function. It always is going to make sure it has enough to keep our heart beating and like do a lot of the basics, keep us upright on 2 feet, things like that. But when it comes down to brain fog, one of my favorite ways to explain this is most of us have been hangry before, right? Where you're hungry, but and you start to get like irritated and, little things like that, even typically if that isn't your profile. And that comes down to the way that fuel is utilized in the brain in a specific area called the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of right here behind our hairline. And the prefrontal cortex plays a big role in cognition. So things like critical thinking, following directions, executive function, and judgment. And it also plays a role in our emotional management too. So when we have a hypoglycemic response, meaning there's not enough in the circulation, as I mentioned before, our brain doesn't have a backup system. There's no like break glass in case of emergency type of power bar just hanging out there. So when blood sugar fluctuates too much, the brain has to do what it can to make sure it's, again, keeping us upright, keeping us safe, and making sure we're going to stay alive for the next little bit. So for that reason, areas of critical thinking and emotional management start to become not as important to the brain when it's dealing with more limited resources and energy. And oftentimes that's a big reason that people get brain fog is they maybe go too long without eating during the day, or maybe they're just not handling their fuel and burning it appropriately. And that's one of the things that we often see. Same thing when we talk about cognitive decline and dementia. There was a great paper that came out of a great scientific review that came out of Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2018. And Sao Paulo is actually this hotbed for brain study, especially because and I don't know exactly how it works, but for the most part, I think people are basically organ donors by default if they're citizens of
Mm.
Sao Paulo. So they have these large populations of cadavers to be able to study, which is a great thing for science. So this study in 2018 was published looking at, I think, about 500 different cadavers and found that people that had appetite issues, especially like low appetite and not eating enough, people that had depression, anxiety, and insomnia were four major risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And there was a pretty huge correlation among that population showing that these things that, in my opinion, are oftentimes driven by these types of metabolic issues that we're talking about are ultimately leading us towards these types of degenerative processes, which Alzheimer's disease and dementia typically is happening in the brain for about 15 to 20 years before we ever show any symptoms, which we're
Mhm.
definitely not about scare tactics or anything like that here. But as a society, we're facing this epidemic right now of cognitive decline, and our society is continuing to age right now with the boomers. The hospital wards, the senior centers, right now they're not really equipped to deal with this. And so things like these dietary interventions, lifestyle management, these things that, like we talked about, all these basic things of taking care of yourself are things that are helping with reducing risk factors for dementia, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline.
Is there anything else specifically that we can do to increase the likelihood of longevity of neurological function. So it seems like dropping the excess weight, it's inflammatory, reversing insulin resistance. We don't want to have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. That seems like it's a high risk factor. So
Right.
what else could we do from, let's say, exercise? I know sleep and stress. Some people do Sudoku or crossword puzzles. What are the other things that we could look at to help the longevity of our neurological function?
You just named a lot of great things. So, and I do Wordle every day, and I send it to
Wait,
my
what is
mom
it
when
called?
I'm done. Wordle, the New York Times app.
Okay.
It's just like word puzzles, just along the lines of
Mm-hmm.
Sudoku, and they have crosswords and things on there, and that's all great things to do. I think exercise is one of the things that people don't always connect the dots in terms of. Exercise is actually something that's really good for the brain. Not just we know it's good for our heart, we know it's good for our muscles. It's really good for our brain as well. There's this chemical called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and you can think of it like Miracle Grow for the brains. It's a chemical that helps our brain, that our neurons secrete to communicate with each other, that tells them, hey, we're proliferating, we're growing, we're learning. And when that chemical is in high concentrations, the brain doesn't go through dementia and atrophy and shrinkage, which is one of the main findings in Alzheimer's disease
Yeah.
and these types of things. So exercise is actually directly increasing BDNF, IGF, insulin-like growth factor, VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, all these chemicals that basically help our brain know to grow and be healthy and repair itself are activated when we do cardiovascular exercise, resistance training. There's a great book by John Rady, who's a trainer, and the book is called Spark. And that's what it talks about, is the crossover between how physical exercise that's typically thought of as, mainly heart healthy and muscle healthy is hugely healthy for this up here too.
So no specific form of exercise, really. It could be lifting weights, it could be walking, cardio.
Exactly. The ideal would be a combination of all those things. Some cardio exercise, some resistance training. There are some other studies that have been out there showing that, in general, things like cardio exercises, so like running on the treadmill, running, over a mile, biking, those kinds of like long-term exercise where you're just maintaining. Those exercises, from a brain standpoint, tend to be good at helping us get more efficient at things we already know. But if you're looking to learn something new or kind of change something about yourself, then high intensity interval training or HIIT training can actually be the best thing for that. So there are some things where, looking at specific types of workouts can actually have a lot of specific benefits for the brain. But in general, in terms of talking about reducing likelihood of cognitive decline, dementia, all those other things that we want to make sure don't happen as we age, pretty much any form of exercise is going to help get you there.
What about hand-eye coordination, like pickleball?
Fantastic. Yeah,
Is
no,
it?
that's absolutely. So one of the things that we use therapeutically here, actually, with a lot of our patients is something called motor cognitive dual tasking, where essentially we're asking the brain to create outputs of moving our body, but when we can have to move our body in very intentional ways that require more critical thinking. So things like sports, I think, are a great example, because you're not just moving for the sake of moving, you're trying to move in specific ways that help you to win the game. So you're problem solving, you're thinking the whole time. I love pickleball, tennis. I think some people kind of laugh at pickleball, but I think it's great. Just anything that
It's
people
so
are doing, get
fun.
outside. I haven't tried it yet, so I guess I'm
It's
missing
great.
out.
Yeah, well, we've got a membership to Racket Club, so we could invite you and play with you.
I would
We
love
take the
that.
kids. I'm not good at it, but I really like it. It's tough.
I bet. I mean, I used to play tennis when I was younger, and then
Hmm.
you kind of, when you're younger, you play like all the sports, and you kind of find your niche. And ice hockey ended up being my thing.
Oh,
But yeah, I loved tennis when I was younger.
yeah. Well, and ice hockey and concussions, I don't know. Was that high risk?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, it's one of those things where I follow pretty closely. There's a lot of discussions in the sport right now about changing the age where they introduce contact and hitting,
Yeah.
and I think it's the type of thing where, as a parent, you don't want to prevent your kids from doing things that are going to be
I
good for
know.
them in a lot of ways. Like ice hockey was like a huge part of me growing up, and a lot of my friends I met through it. A lot of my, when you're a kid and developing self confidence, sports can be
Hmm.
great. Being part of a team, there's all sorts of benefits to that. But concussions I suffered in college was actually part of how I started down this career path. So that's definitely something that hits close to home to me for sure.
Yeah, put purpose in your step. My son, he's 11, and I said to him years back, you can do any sport, just not football, because it scares me from a concussion standpoint. And of course, what's the one sport he wants to play is football. Doesn't it
Yep.
happen like that? So that's
Yeah.
what he's all into. Nothing you can do, because I don't want to prevent him from all the things that you just mentioned that are just as important.
And like you mentioned too, metabolic health is going to help to determine how someone reacts to a head impact.
Hmm.
So for example, there are some cool studies out there showing that a specific antioxidant called N-acetylcysteine,
Hmm.
when taken as a supplement, can actually help to reduce or basically improve resiliency to things like concussions and head impacts from sports or falls or whatever it is. And that goes back to things like the blood-brain barrier and blood flow to the brain.
So I need to supplement him with NAC, and we'll be okay.
That would definitely be a good place to start. Yeah, absolutely.
So you talked really briefly, you mentioned brain fog post COVID, which I mean, with my three young kids, I've had COVID so many times, which I'm sure a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And the post COVID brain fog was real, at least for my experience. Why does that happen? And are there any things that we can do to reduce the severity of it? Or maybe the next time we get COVID, not experience brain fog?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's the medical community has learned so much in the past couple of years about viruses in so many
Mhm.
different ways. This COVID epidemic or pandemic, was unfortunate for a lot of people who died. But in terms of medical research about viruses, we've learned so much, especially as it pertains to things like you talked about with brain fog. And I think a lot of it comes down to those bouncers and those security guards in the brain, the microglia and the blood-brain barrier, which
Mhm.
tend to, when we're seeing viruses in the body, right? It's like, well, there's an invader. We need to siren the alarms. We need to create all these defenses that are good for helping us eliminate the invaders. But it's kind of like the police and the fire trucks. Everyone just hangs around for way too long. Our brains are good at
Okay.
inflaming, but not always good at deflaming. And that's where there are some great studies on supplements like vitamin A, vitamin E, selenium, zinc as ways to help reduce these detrimental effects of viral infections, whether it's COVID or other infections, Epstein-Barr
Mhm.
virus, or mononucleosis that a lot of people get in high school as the kissing disease. We find that in a lot of people becomes elevated after brain injuries because these viruses kind of hang out in our body in low levels, and then when our immune system is insulted or it's not able to work as well, they can then, in an opportunistic way, sort of proliferate. And as they proliferate, they start to have more detrimental effects on us. We see a lot of patients for post-COVID types
Mhm.
of brain issues here, whether it's full-on encephalopathy or post-COVID brain fog. We actually had a woman come in from Tennessee towards the end of last year where her main complaint was just that she never got her smell back. And
Mhm.
she's starting to smell. She got like really excited when she drove by a gas station. It was like, I smelled the gas. I smelled the
Yeah.
gas. But it's all related to what we talked about with those defenses. If our brain is good at having those defenses, and we need them to protect us. Excuse me. But it's also important to know when to kind of calm those defenses down and restore more normal brain function. So, the it hasn't been 100%. Nothing in medical research is rarely 100%. But that's one of the things right now that's the most implicated or most evidence points to in terms of post-COVID and brain fog.
And so to get that mounted response lowered, you can take those vitamins you mentioned. What else do you do?
That can be a good way to start. Depending on the severity of what you're dealing with, it might be
Mhm.
worth, a more in-depth neurological evaluation.
Mhm.
But all the other things like exercise can be hugely important as well. And the same thing of just making sure that you're taking care of your metabolic health. One of those interesting things that's a link that a lot of people may not know about is there's a lot of research showing changes to dental health and heart health
Mhm.
and also brain health. So all the risk factors we talked about for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline, poor dental health is actually one of those things. This is the start of our GI tract right here, and we have a microbiome in our mouth. So brushing your teeth and flossing is one of those simple things that you're helping your microbiome, you're helping your gut health, and ultimately you're helping your brain.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, are there any common misconceptions or myths about brain health that you often hear either from your patients or people on social media that you'd like to clear up or that you could share with us?
Sure. I think the main thing would be, anyone who's advertising any sort of one thing for your brain, every brain is different. When we talk to our TBI patients, a great mentor of mine once said, when you've seen a traumatic brain injury, you've seen one traumatic brain
Mm.
injury, because the brain is such a complex organ that when we injure it, it's really tough to say, what that outcome is going to be for people. So, we do everything we can to get away from cookie cutter types of interventions because we just don't find them to be effective, and it's just not a good use of everyone's time. So we try to work as specifically with people as possible. One of my pet peeves, and Dr. Trafer, the owner of Apex, shares this with me, is when you see something on social media that's like, oh, here, activate your vagus nerve. This activates your vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, for people who may not know, is part of our nervous system that helps to digest our food. It goes from the brain down into our gut. So if you've heard of gut-brain connection, the vagus nerve is hugely implicated in that. But autonomic imbalances, things like anxiety, excessive fight or flight responses, depression, all these other types of issues people deal with, it's much more complex than just activating the vagus nerve. While it certainly may have a time and place, it's one of those things that people put a video up on Instagram or something, and I did this, whatever vagus nerve exercise, and it got rid of my seizures or whatever it is. And,
Hmm.
those sort of fantastical claims, or anyone that uses the word hacking, right? Like we're going to brain hack, we're going to hack our brain, because the brain doesn't take shortcuts. It's the brain is going to keep you accountable for what you're doing every day. So that's why we generally recommend a lot of the lifestyle medicine and interventions as the best way
Hmm.
to have a healthy brain. Instead of thinking, oh, well, that stuff doesn't matter. I'll just like take this one supplement, and then I'll go eat Burger King.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that. There's no cheating. There's no out supplementing a bad diet.
So it has to be more of a comprehensive plan.
Yeah, and our brain is always responding and even rewiring itself to what we do on a 24-hour basis. So
Hmm.
that's encouraging too, right? Because tomorrow is a new 24 hours. So it's another chance to start.
Yeah, when I visited your center, you have a lot of different lasers, a lot of different tools to act as a part of the comprehensive plan that you guys create for each person. And I know we talked a little bit about it, but would you share with us about the non-invasive laser and how it helps with everything we've discussed from a metabolic situation perspective?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we have a few different types of laser devices in our office to be applied transcranially, meaning through the skull to affect different parts of the brain, transabdominally, so like the abdomen to affect the vagus nerve, and affect the way that those visceral organs are functioning. But a lot of people come to us without the ability to exercise, whether it's, severe forms of phobias and anxieties and psychiatric issues, whether it's movement difficulty because someone's in a wheelchair after a car accident, or hemiplegic after a stroke. So the brain still needs exercise even if the body can't do it. So a lot of the therapies that we have here in the office are what we call exercise mimetics, or ways that we can mimic the effects of exercise on the body. And whole body vibration is a great one. Another
Yeah.
great one is, like you mentioned, the Zerona non-invasive fat loss laser, which is the only FDA approved treatment that actually helps to take inches off the waistline is what the FDA approval is for. And as you mentioned earlier, the midline and waist belly fat is more inflammatory and more detrimental to brain health. So a lot of times we're taking our patients that are immobile, or maybe, after a brain injury with the severity of their depression, they didn't leave their house and they ate a ton of junk food for a few years, and now their body habitus is much larger than before. We use the Zerona laser in conjunction with lifestyle changes, exercises, and other interventions to just kind of help kickstart that system, and help people with feeling like change is possible. I'm sure that's something that you can speak to with your clients as well, is just that idea of the brain has to believe that change is possible, and there has to be that hope factor there for these things to happen, for the brain to change itself.
Yeah, hope is the biggest thing. And,
absolutely,
together between you and me, we've seen thousands and thousands of folks make huge positive change in their lives. So if you're listening to this and you have the desire to make some kind of change, and just know that you can. We've seen it happen every day. We see it. So Dr. Z, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us before we leave?
Let me think. I think that there's a lot to be said for people. One of the greatest quotes I ever heard about health is that thinking that your health is the greatest mistake you can make with your health is thinking it's someone else's responsibility. So I like people that take a more active approach in their care. And, I have people that'll come to me and they'll be asking me this list of questions of things that they maybe found on the internet or otherwise. And they're, oh, I'm sorry. And it's like, no, I like discussing this with you, because if I'm helping you understand this better, I'm helping your long-term trajectory in a huge way. And that's part of why we enjoy working with you as well, is that we know you take that same time with your patients, and understanding and hope. Those are the two things that the brain needs, and the sky's the limit.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Z, where can people learn more about you and all the great work that you guys do?
Sure. So our website has all sorts of great resources. There's a blog up there. There's articles about some of the different services and conditions we work with. But also check out our Instagram. It's just at Apex Brain Centers, and we're on Facebook as well. And reach out, send me a message on Instagram. I love just starting dialogues with people, and let me know if there's a particular brain health interest or topic that, people want to hear about. And I'm more than happy to, nerd out on it a little bit.
Great. Well, I always encourage comments. And so hopefully we get a lot of comments and questions, and I'll pass them along to you and you can help me answer them.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds like a good trade.
Thank you so much, Dr. Z. I really appreciate your time and your willingness on coming on the show here.
Awesome. No, thank you so much. It was really my pleasure. And I'm looking forward to just, continuing our conversations, and maybe we'll film a part 2 down the line.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. If you are listening to this on a podcast platform, please follow and leave a review. If you're watching this on YouTube, like we said in the show, please, we love questions. Drop your questions and comments below in the comment section. I'll make sure to pass those that I want Dr. Z to answer directly to his inbox. So do not hold back. We're here to help you and guide you as much as we can. Remember, you've got to step up to make the change. Lead with your heart, train your mind, and do not negotiate with your body. I'll see you next time.